Have you ever finished a meal and realized you barely remembered eating it? The food was there. Your hands moved. Your mouth chewed. But your mind, it was somewhere else entirely. Scrolling through messages, half listening to a podcast, lost in tomorrow's worries or yesterday's regrets. The plate emptied, the stomach filled, but the soul stayed hungry. In a world of endless distraction, we've forgotten one of the simplest, most profound human experiences, the sacred act of eating. Not just as a way to fuel the body, but as a moment to reconnect with ourselves, with the earth, and with the countless unseen hands that brought each bite to our lips. In ancient temples nestled deep within misty mountains, monks gather in silence for their morning meal. No words are spoken, no rush, no multitasking, a single bowl of rice, a small cup of broth, and the crisp scent of morning air. For them, this isn't just breakfast, it's meditation, it's prayer. It's a ritual of gratitude and awareness where every grain of rice is seen, held, respected. They call it mindful eating. But you don't need to shave your head or retreat to a monastery to taste what they taste, to experience what they experience. Because the art of mindful eating isn't locked away in ancient scrolls or secret rituals. It's right here, waiting to be remembered. In your own kitchen, at your crowded dining table, in the quiet, everyday moments you've been too busy to notice. And maybe, just maybe, it's the very medicine your restless, overstimulated heart has been craving. You see, in Buddhist tradition, how we eat is considered just as important as what we eat. Because the way we consume food mirrors the way we consume life itself. If we eat with greed, we live with greed. If we eat with gratitude, we live with gratitude. If we rush through our meals, numb to flavor, detached from the present, we rush through our days, numb to beauty, detached from meaning. The Buddha once taught, when you eat, just eat. Simple words, but like so many simple things, easier said than done. Because modern life, it doesn't make space for slowness. It sells us speed, convenience, instant gratification. We eat on the go. We eat while working. We eat to cope, to numb, to distract. And somewhere along the way, we stop tasting our food. We no longer notice the burst of sweetness in a ripe mango, the earthy warmth of a roasted potato, the cool, clean crunch of a cucumber fresh from the garden. But what if we could reclaim that? Not as a trendy health hack, not as another thing to master, but as a doorway, a quiet, everyday doorway to wake up, to see clearly, to live deeply. That's what this journey is about. It's not about diets or calories or forbidden foods. It's about presence. It's about awareness. It's about honoring the life within the food you eat and the life within you that receives it. Imagine this for a moment, a simple bowl of soup before you, steam curling upwards like incense smoke. You inhale, feeling the warmth fill your lungs. You notice the play of colors, orange carrots, green scallions, delicate herbs dancing on the surface. You lift the spoon, not in haste but with care, and as the broth touches your tongue, you taste it, truly taste it, not just the flavor but the story behind it, the sun that ripened the vegetables, the farmer's calloused hands, the rain that fed the soil, the countless small miracles it took for this exact moment to arrive. And in that moment, you remember, this isn't just food, this is life. This is the universe gathered in a single spoonful. And you are part of it. For thousands of years, Buddhist practitioners have approached meals with this kind of reverence. They begin each one with what are called the 5 contemplations, quiet reflections to anchor the mind, open the heart, and dissolve the illusion of separateness. And while you might not have a monastery bell to call you to breakfast, you have something just as powerful, your breath, your awareness, your choice, to pause, to notice, to savor, to turn the ordinary act of eating into an extraordinary act of living. Because here's a truth we often forget, every meal is a chance to practice, to nourish not just your body but your compassion, your patience, your gratitude. You don't need exotic superfoods. You don't need elaborate rituals. You only need this moment, and the willingness to be here for it. This practice of mindful eating might seem small. insignificant even. But as the Zen masters teach, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. So today, as you lift your next forkful, ask yourself, am I truly here? Am I awake for this moment? And if the answer is no, that's okay. It's never too late to begin again. The next bite is always waiting. When we return, let's explore what it really means to eat mindfully, not as a distant philosophy, but as a living, breathing practice. One you can begin today, right where you are. So what does it really mean to eat mindfully? Is it just about slowing down, chewing longer, turning off your phone while you eat? Well, yes and no. At its heart, mindful eating is about presence. It's about truly arriving in the moment, in your body, in your senses, in your heart, and experiencing food not just as fuel, but as life. It's the practice of being fully awake for every bite, noticing colors, textures, flavors, sounds, feeling the warmth of a bowl in your hands, tasting the subtle sweetness in a simple grain of rice, listening to the quiet symphony of your body receiving nourishment. You see, in the teachings of the Buddha, mindfulness, or sati, means remembering. Not remembering in the sense of recalling the past, but in remembering to be here now. To remember that you're alive. To remember that this moment matters. And when you apply that to eating, something ordinary becomes sacred. The act of lifting a spoon to your lips becomes a meditation, a communion with the world around you. It's no longer about devouring what's on your plate. It's about discovering it. Mindful eating asks you to pause, to breathe, to see your food as more than just objects to be consumed, but as offerings from the earth, shaped by unseen hands, ripened by sunlight and rain. And most importantly, it asks you to notice what's happening inside you as you eat. Is your stomach truly hungry, or is your heart aching for something else? Are you reaching for that second helping because your body needs it, or because your mind is restless? We eat for so many reasons: to celebrate, to numb, to comfort, to escape. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But when we eat unconsciously, we miss the deeper conversation happening between our body and our soul. Buddhist masters often remind us that how we do one thing is how we do everything. If we rush through our meals half present, we tend to rush through our lives the same way. And mindful eating becomes a mirror, a way to see ourselves clearly. You'll begin to notice the habits you didn't realize were there, the tendency to eat quickly when you're anxious, the urge to snack late at night out of loneliness, the craving for sugar when your spirit feels dull. And in that noticing, something powerful happens. You create a space, a pause between impulse and action, and in that pause lies freedom. You're no longer a prisoner of automatic habits. You're awake, you're choosing. And that is the essence of Buddhist practice. Not renouncing the world, not escaping pleasure, but engaging with life moment by moment with eyes open, heart steady, and mind clear. In the ancient monastic traditions, every meal begins with a few simple questions. Where has this food come from? Who grew it? Who prepared it? Is it worthy of my gratitude? Will it nourish both my body and my practice? Now imagine carrying those questions into your daily meals, not as a chore, but as a quiet ritual. You don't need candles. You don't need chanting monks. You only need the willingness to be present. Maybe you'll notice the pattern of seeds in a slice of papaya, the way the light hits a cup of tea, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing between bites. And with each small noticing, you return to yourself. You return to life. Mindful eating isn't about perfection. It's not about shaming yourself for fast food or guilty pleasures. It's about waking up to your experience, whatever it is, and holding it with kindness. Because the truth is, every bite you take carries a story of soil, sun, wind, labor. And when you eat mindfully, you become part of that story. You honor the interconnectedness of all things, the farmer's hands, the rain cloud's generosity, the earth's endless patience. And somewhere in that simple, humble act, you remember something you didn't even realize you'd forgotten: that you belong here, that you are sustained not just by calories but by the great breathing web of life itself. So what is mindful eating? It's presence, it's gratitude, it's awareness. It's a way of weaving sacredness back into the mundane. And it doesn't require a special diet. It doesn't demand discipline. It only asks that you show up for yourself, for your food, for this moment. Because each time you do, you plant a seed of calm, a seed of reverence, a seed of awakening. And over time, those seeds grow into a gentler relationship with your body, a clearer relationship with your desires, a deeper relationship with life. In the quiet spaces between bites, in the stillness of a well-chewed mouthful, the ordinary becomes miraculous. And when you learn to taste life in a simple spoonful, you begin to taste it everywhere. Let's keep walking this path together. Next, we'll explore how food shapes not just our bodies, but our hearts, our minds, and even the quality of our thoughts. Because what we consume consumes us. There's a quiet moment in many Buddhist monasteries, just before the first spoon is lifted, before a single grain of rice meets the tongue, a moment of pause, of reflection, of gratitude. It's a practice known as the 5 contemplations before eating. Simple, elegant, and profoundly transformative. You see, in our modern world, we rarely stop to consider the journey of our food. We eat while scrolling, while driving, while distracted by 100 voices in our heads. But the ancient teachers knew, when we forget the source of our nourishment, we forget something of ourselves. And so, before every meal, they would recite 5 quiet reflections, not as a ritual of obligation, but as a doorway back to presence. Let's walk through them together. The first contemplation. I consider the effort that brought this food to me. Pause and think, where did this come from? Who planted the seeds? Who harvested the grains? Who cooked this meal, cleaned the dishes, prepared this moment for you to receive? Thousands of unseen hands move in silent coordination to place food upon your table. The farmer in a distant field, the rain that fell upon the crops, the truck driver on a long, lonely road, the cook in a kitchen, stirring with care. When you eat with this awareness, even a simple bowl of rice becomes an offering of the earth itself. The second contemplation. I reflect on my own conduct to see whether I am worthy of receiving this offering. But not in a way of shame, not to judge yourself harshly, but to gently ask, am I living in a way that honors this gift? Do my actions, words, and thoughts nourish others the way this food nourishes me? It's a quiet invitation to integrity, a reminder that every meal is a chance to renew your vow to live kindly, to live consciously. The third contemplation. I guard my mind against faults, especially greed. Greed, the endless voice that says, more, faster, sweeter, now. When we eat mindlessly, it's easy to consume not from hunger but from habit, to keep reaching, even when our body has had enough, to fill the hollow spaces of the heart with things that were never meant to fit there. This contemplation isn't about denying pleasure, it's about recognizing when pleasure becomes attachment, and choosing awareness over impulse. The fourth contemplation. I take this food as medicine to sustain my body. It's a radical shift, from eating for entertainment to eating for life. This doesn't mean every meal must be bland or joyless. In fact, the opposite. When you see food as medicine, you cherish it more. You savor each bite, knowing it repairs your cells, strengthens your bones, fuels your spirit. It becomes less about how much you consume and more about how deeply you receive it. And the fifth contemplation. I accept this food to realize the path of awakening. Yes, even eating can be part of your spiritual journey. Every bite an opportunity to wake up, to practice presence, to cultivate gratitude, to remember the simple miracle of being alive. This is not some distant, abstract philosophy reserved for monks in robes. It's available to you here in your own kitchen, in the steam rising from your morning tea, in the crunch of an apple between your teeth, in the warmth of a bowl held between both hands. Each of these contemplations is a thread, and when you gather them together, they weave a tapestry of mindfulness, a daily practice that softens the edges of your restlessness, that calls you back to your body, that reminds you you belong to this earth. You belong to this breath. You belong to this meal. And here's the beautiful part. You don't need to recite these out loud. You don't even need to memorize them. You only need to pause. Maybe before your next meal, you'll take a breath. You'll notice the colors on your plate. You'll wonder where your food was grown. You'll feel the quiet blessing of being nourished. And in that moment, you'll be practicing the 5 contemplations, not as an obligation, but as a return, a homecoming, a way of saying, I am here, and I am grateful. And slowly, meal by meal, you'll find something begins to shift. The same way a stone smooths over time in a flowing river, your meals become simpler, your cravings gentler, your relationship with yourself kinder. Not because you forced it, but because you remembered what it means to truly receive. Now, let's journey deeper. If eating can be sacred, if food can be medicine, then surely the way we listen to our bodies must hold its own wisdom too. Let's find out. Have you ever noticed how, when you slow down, when you truly pay attention to a moment, a sunset, a kind word, the warmth of tea against your palm, it feels bigger than itself, as though life quietly reveals its hidden depth? The same is true for eating. And now, modern science is beginning to catch up with what ancient monks have known for centuries, that how we eat matters just as much as what we eat. That presence, simple, intentional awareness, can transform not only our relationship with food, but with ourselves. Let's explore what the science reveals when we bring mindfulness to the table. When researchers at Harvard, UCLA, and dozens of other institutions began studying mindful eating, what they discovered was both profound and beautifully simple. Participants who practiced mindful eating, slowing down, noticing flavors, textures, and their body's natural hunger cues, experienced measurable changes. Stress levels dropped, not because their workload vanished, not because life became easier, but because the act of slowing down created space between impulse and action. And in that space, anxiety softened. Weight naturally balanced itself, not through strict dieting, calorie counting, or shame, but because mindful eaters listened. They ate when their body asked for nourishment and paused when it was satisfied, without rules, without guilt, simply through awareness. Digestion improved. You see, the body digests best in a parasympathetic state, what scientists call rest and digest. When you eat while stressed, scrolling your phone, or arguing across the dinner table, your nervous system stays in fight or flight. Blood flow is diverted away from the stomach, slowing digestion, causing bloating, discomfort, even long-term imbalance. But when you pause, when you breathe, when you eat in silence or gentle conversation, your body recognizes safety. And in that safety, it heals. Blood sugar stabilizes, cravings decrease, sleep improves, and perhaps most surprisingly, emotional well-being deepens, because mindful eating isn't just about food. It's about the stories we tell ourselves around food. It's about meeting our hungers for comfort, for control, for sweetness, with kindness instead of judgment. It's about learning the difference between physical hunger and emotional craving. And here's where ancient wisdom meets modern insight. In Buddhist teachings, every craving is seen as a wave. It rises, peaks, and naturally falls if left unattended. The suffering comes not from the craving itself, but from the grasping, the desperate attempt to fill a void with what can never satisfy it. Mindful eating teaches us to ride those waves, to witness desire without collapsing into it, to pause and ask, what am I truly hungry for right now? Is it food, or comfort, or escape, or perhaps the simple ache of loneliness disguised as an empty stomach? And when we answer honestly with compassion rather than critique, something remarkable happens. We start to heal the deeper hungers. In clinical settings, mindful eating has been shown to help individuals recover from binge eating, emotional eating, and patterns of compulsive dieting, not by enforcing discipline, but by nurturing presence. A 2017 study published in the journal Obesity found that participants who engaged in an 8-week mindful eating program experienced significant reductions in binge eating episodes, and those effects lasted even after the program ended. Not because their willpower increased, but because their awareness did. And isn't that the heart of spiritual practice? To wake up from unconscious habits, to soften the reflex of reaching for what numbs us, and to turn, instead, toward what restores us. Mindful eating is not a diet. It's a way of being, a way of inhabiting your life with both feet planted firmly in the present moment, a way of honoring the body as both fragile and miraculous. And perhaps most importantly, it's a way of returning home to yourself. Because when you eat with awareness, when you taste the sweetness of a single berry, the warmth of rice, the texture of bread baked with care, you remember something ancient, something primal, that you too are part of this earth, that your body knows its own wisdom, that hunger is not your enemy, nor is craving your failure. They are signals, guides, teachers. And when met with mindfulness, they become pathways back to balance. So the science confirms what the monks always knew. When we eat with presence, we heal more than our bodies. We heal our hearts, our restless minds, our forgotten gratitude. And what began as a simple meal transforms into something sacred. And this raises a tender question. If mindful eating can calm the body, steady the heart, and lift the fog of craving, then surely the first place to begin is learning to listen. Not to the noise of the world, but to the quiet voice within. Let's step into that silence together. There's a quiet kind of power in a story. Not the grand, sweeping kind found in ancient myths, but the small, tender ones. The kind that happens around a kitchen table, in the stillness of a midnight fridge light, in the first bite of a meal after years of war with oneself. Tonight, let me tell you a few of those, because it's easy to speak of mindful eating in theory. It's another thing entirely to witness what happens when real people, messy, imperfect, beautiful people, let it into their lives. There's Anna, a corporate executive in her early 40s, juggling deadlines, flights, and an endless stream of emails. For years, meals were a blur. Protein bars in taxis, coffee in boardrooms, late-night takeout devoured in front of glowing screens. She didn't realize how much her body was begging for her attention, until a health scare, a routine checkup turned serious, forced her to slow down. On the advice of a kind-hearted nutritionist, Anna tried something strange. 1 meal a day, eaten in silence without her phone. No deadlines, no distractions, just her and the food. At first, she said, it felt unbearable. The silence made her itch. The taste of her food felt unfamiliar. But then something shifted. She noticed the warmth of soup, the texture of toasted bread, the gentle rise and fall of her breath between bites. Weeks turned into months. And while her blood pressure lowered and her stress markers improved, the real change was subtler. For the first time in years, she confessed, I felt like I came back to myself. I didn't realize how hungry I was for quiet. Then there's David, a retired firefighter haunted by memories too heavy for words. Food had long been his comfort and his punishment. A cycle of binging and guilt, brief moments of solace swallowed by self-loathing. A local mindfulness teacher introduced David to the practice of eating a single raisin with full awareness. He laughed at the idea. A raisin, what difference could that make? But in that tiny act, noticing its wrinkled skin, its weight on his tongue, its sudden burst of sweetness, something cracked open. It wasn't about the raisin, David said later, eyes shining. It was about feeling present in my own life for the first time in years. That one moment led to another, and another, until mindful eating became his way of honoring both his past and his healing. Maria's story is different. A young mother of 2, battling postpartum depression and the crushing expectations of perfection. Food was functional, fuel for survival, shoved down between diaper changes and sleepless nights. But one evening, at a mindfulness retreat a friend dragged her to, she heard the teacher say, "Every bite is a chance to remember you're alive." It struck her like lightning. She cried over a single orange wedge. Not because it was miraculous, but because she realized she hadn't tasted a thing in months. Maria began setting aside 10 minutes each day just for herself. A cup of tea, a bowl of rice, a piece of chocolate. And in those moments the fog lifted. Not all at once, but enough to remind her she wasn't lost. Mindful eating saved my life, she told me, in the smallest, quietest ways. These are not stories of overnight miracles. No one became a monk. No one unlocked enlightenment in a week. But each of them, Anna, David, Maria, found a thread, a way back to their bodies, to gratitude, to healing. And that's the quiet revolution of mindful eating. It's not about perfection. It's not a diet. It's not a moral test. It's about presence, about witnessing your own life without turning away. In a world that demands we move faster, achieve more, and numb our hunger for real connection, mindful eating is a radical act of rebellion. A way of saying, I choose to be here in this moment with this meal in this body. And it ripples outward. Health improves. Relationships soften. The noise inside quiets. Not because the world changes, but because we begin to meet it differently. These stories aren't rare. There are thousands more. Perhaps even yours. Perhaps someone you love. And in hearing them, perhaps you've begun to wonder what might happen if you too slowed down. If you gave yourself permission to taste, to notice, to breathe. The truth is, you don't have to move to a monastery. You don't need to give up chocolate or wine. You don't have to fix yourself. You only have to arrive. And perhaps, if you listen closely, your body has been waiting to welcome you home. Now, having seen how mindfulness reshapes real lives, it's time to turn inward. To tune in to the ancient wisdom your body carries, the signals it sends, and the gentle art of listening. Let's step into that sacred space next. It's one thing to feel inspired by a story, to hear about transformation and healing and think, maybe someday I'll try that. But life isn't lived someday, it's lived here, in the cluttered kitchen, at the roadside noodle stand, in the stolen lunch breaks between meetings. And the truth is, mindful eating was never meant for mountaintops or meditation retreats. It was born for ordinary days, for you exactly where you are. So how do we bring it into daily life? How do we turn theory into a quiet, nourishing practice that softens the sharp edges of modern living? Let's begin gently. First, set an intention before you eat. It doesn't have to be a grand ceremony. No incense, no chanting, just a pause. Before your next meal, even if it's a humble sandwich or a cup of instant noodles, take a single breath. In that breath, silently acknowledge, I am here. I am about to nourish this body. This simple moment shifts you from autopilot into awareness. It marks a subtle crossing, from consuming to receiving. Next, notice your food. Look at its color, its shape, its fragrance. Where did this rice come from? How many hands touched it before it arrived here? The farmers, the rain, the earth itself. This is not about guilt or moralizing. It's about remembering that your meal is a small miracle of interconnected lives. A tangible expression of interbeing, as Thich NH letter 1EA5T, H letter 1EA1NH so beautifully taught. Even in the simplest meal, the whole cosmos is present. Now take your first bite. Slowly. Let it linger. Notice the texture. Is it crisp, soft, warm, cool? Taste it without distraction. It's astonishing how food transforms when you're truly there to meet it. The burst of sweetness in a cherry tomato. The silky richness of ripe avocado. The steady comfort of warm rice. In those first few mindful bites, you open a doorway. And beyond it lies a deeper kind of nourishment. If your mind wanders, and it will, gently bring it back. To the taste, to the scent, to the sensation of chewing, swallowing, pausing. This is not about control, it's about kindness, about noticing when you've drifted and returning without judgment. As one Zen master said, when you eat, just eat. Consider eating in silence now and then. Not always, but perhaps once a week. A meal without TV, without scrolling, without conversation. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. We're so used to filling space. But in that quiet, you'll hear something precious, the gentle conversation between your body and your food, the subtle way your stomach speaks before your mind catches up. Enough. More, please. I'm grateful. You can also use cues to anchor yourself, perhaps lighting a candle before dinner, or saying a silent thank you, or placing your phone face down and out of reach. Small, consistent gestures create sacred space in the everyday. And if you forget, if you wolf down a bag of chips while standing over the sink, that's okay too. Mindful eating isn't a purity contest, it's a practice. And like all practices, it's built on returning, again and again. Another beautiful practice is the 5 contemplations before eating. If you remember from earlier, it's a moment of reflection before your meal, not as obligation, but as gratitude. A way to honor the unseen labor and living things that sustain you. You might adapt it in your own words, or even a simple whisper. Thank you, earth. Thank you, hands. Thank you, life. And perhaps most importantly, release perfection. Some days you'll eat mindfully, savor every bite. Other days you'll forget, caught in deadlines and traffic and tangled emotions. That's human. That's practice. That's enough. As Zen teacher Kabun Chino Roshi once said, when you lose your way, the way appears. Mindful eating isn't about doing it right. It's about remembering for one breath, one bite, one moment that you are alive. And when you live like this, a little more aware, a little more present, you begin to taste the sacred in the ordinary, the warmth of tea on a cold afternoon, the crisp sweetness of a morning apple, the simple, wordless joy of sharing a meal with someone you love. This is the art of mindful eating, not a diet, not a doctrine, but a practice of returning home, to yourself, to this moment, to the quiet, ever-present miracle of being here. Now, as we near the closing chapter of this journey together, it's time to reflect on everything we've seen, tasted, remembered, and on what it means to rediscover the sacred, one simple meal at a time.